Hello, everybody. This is Amy Tebow in Cypress, Texas, and I am acting for Pam Gothart today as your host and cheerleader, whatever, for our look at the untold story about Pearl Harbor. Our presenter today is Michael Hutchinson, and he is going to introduce himself and give us some background. I would like for you to feel free to jump in at any time with questions, but I'm going to mute everybody, so you need to use your chat feature, which is the very last thing on your menu on the right side. If you go all the way down to the bottom and click on the plus sign next to chat, it will open up a place for you to type any questions, and they will pop up, and Michael will have a chance to see them. So without any further ado, Michael, take it on, and I will mute myself, and we'll be ready to go.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thanks, Amy. As Amy said, tonight our session will deal with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we'll investigate what happened that day using Stratologica as one of our sources or one of our resources that will help us understand what happened and give us a little bit of an idea of how we might be able to make this a teachable moment with our students. So if we take just a moment to start, I'll show this map again in a few minutes. This is a map of the island of Oahu as it looked on December 7th, 1941, and some things that are very, very familiar names to us: Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Pearl Harbor, of course, the different radio sites. So this is what the people of Honolulu saw that day, and unfortunately this is what the Japanese saw as well. Before we begin, Amy's already mentioned a fair amount of this, but I'll just run through it very quickly with you. She's muted your microphones already. If you have questions as we go through the session, feel free to type your questions in the chat box. Amy and I will monitor the chat as we go along in the session. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, and then as we have time at the end of the session, we'll answer questions and answers then too. So geographically, if you type your name, I'll just tell everybody who I am real quickly. Okay, my name is Michael Hutchison. I am Social Studies Department Chair at Lincoln High School in Vincennes, Indiana. I am a curriculum contributor for PBS as well as Social Studies School Service. Most recently, I completed lessons along with other lesson developers for the Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War. So that was something that was very interesting to do last spring and throughout the summer. I'm also past president of the Indiana Computer Educators Organization. We are the state affiliate for the International Society for Technology and Education, or ISTE. And I am a certified active classroom and Stratologica facilitator for both Social Studies School Service and for Nystrom Education. So let's start our discussion this evening by looking at U.S. history dates that are recognizable just by the date that they occurred. So if I gave you the date of November 22nd, 1963, most everybody automatically would say, I know exactly what happened that day. If you're a certain age, you'll remember that that was the day of the JFK assassination. You probably remember where you were, what you were doing, that sort of thing. And of course, July 20, 1969, that's the day of the first manned moon landing, Apollo 11. September 11, 2001, most likely anybody who's listening in this evening will have an idea about what happened that day. That was the attack on America. That was the attack on the World Trade Center and also on the Pentagon. And of course, December 7th, 1941 is a date that not only lives in infamy, but it's also a date that's ingrained in our memory. No one probably thinks of the date of December 7th without automatically thinking of Pearl Harbor. So let's talk a little bit about the attack itself and the statistics on the attack. As we start this evening, you'll notice the graphic that's on the right side. This is a screenshot that comes directly from Stratologica, and it's the World War II in the Pacific screen map. And so I use that to put together the presentation that you're more than welcome to view or download, and I'll give you some ideas about how to do that as we get closer to the end of tonight's session. But to give you an idea of the statistics as far as the attack, there were roughly about 2,400 military that were killed at Pearl Harbor. Roughly about half of them were killed on board the USS Arizona. There were 68 civilians that were killed as well. And that is fairly comparable to the number of people who were killed on September 11, 2001 in the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and of course on board the airplanes. There were 18 American ships, most of them destroyers, that were destroyed or damaged. And there were 350 planes that were destroyed or damaged at Hickam Field and at various sites at Pearl Harbor. And of course, this leads itself to the question, could it all have been avoided? Could there have been some way that this might not have ever happened? Were we so much asleep that we just didn't know? And so this is a good question to bring up with students. What exactly happened and why were we so complacent? And certainly, you know, we'll kind of go over some of that, but certainly this is something your students may have some interesting information about as we go along as well. Things that they've seen in documentaries, what they've seen in movies, all kinds of things like that. Again, this is another view of the same map. I just took a different screenshot of it. And as you can tell, what you see here is the route that the Japanese took from the Japanese mainland to Pearl Harbor. And what I suggest that you might start having the students do at this point is using the ruler tool in Stratologica, and I'll show you how to access that in an upcoming slide, to just measure the distance from the Japanese mainland to Pearl Harbor itself. And you might bring this up as either this class discussion or some kind of decision-making activity where students pair up or whatever, in terms of what problems did the Japanese face in executing this attack? How easy or how difficult of a trip was this? So the ruler tool will tell them that it's several thousand miles between Pearl Harbor and the Japanese mainland, and the route that they took was definitely not an easy route to take. It was a more northern route, and as a result of that, it was much more difficult to do. So students would make conclusions, or they would interact with you about, oh, this is how many miles it is from Pearl Harbor to the Japanese mainland. This is how difficult that would be, and so as a result of it, this attack was much more difficult than maybe most people had thought of. So how to find a ruler tool? Well, if you look at the bottom of the screen where the map is, and again, I've taken a screenshot, you can see the toolbox, and I've opened the toolbox for you with the marker tool and the push pin, and the text tool and the symbol tool. And there's also the ruler tool. So if you click at one point and then move to another point on the map, the ruler tool will tell you how far of a distance that is in actual miles on the globe. So that's not a very difficult task. Younger students could do that fairly easily as well. So let's get back to what I like to call the end of the innocence. And what I'm referring to here is what Hawaii looked like in the morning of December 7th and how that changed dramatically in just a few hours. So just as we looked at when we did the title slide, you get an idea of various points at Pearl Harbor or on Oahu that were significant, and I'll definitely talk about points, for example, the Apana radio station or radar site, Hickam Field, and as I mentioned, some of these are now ingrained in our memory because of the significance of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So let's move on to where the Pacific Fleet was located that morning. And so all I did here was I found a map online, and I just copied it and pasted the the address, I just embedded it in a push pin in Stratologica. And as you can tell, that what I remember very plainly, one of the Japanese pilots said that to him, the destroyers below were like sardines packed side by side. And as you can see, that's exactly how they looked in the harbor. So a question that you might ask your students, either in class discussion or even as far as having a writing prompt or whatever, is asking them to look at the configuration of the ships and determine or speculate how might this arrangement have made it difficult for U.S. naval forces to respond or to react to the Japanese attack. Well, I could see, and you could see very plainly, if I'm on board the West Virginia or if I'm on board the Tennessee, it's impossible for me to move because there's ships directly in front of me, there are ships directly behind me. So in that regard, the ships were laid out as sitting ducks because they couldn't get out of the way of the Japanese bombs or the Japanese torpedoes. So they were, they just didn't anticipate a possible attack. Now, why did this happen? Why did they not anticipate? I suppose the best way to look at it would be, again, go back to the distance between the Japanese mainland and Pearl Harbor. You're miles and miles away. The commander looks out the window and he sees palm trees, he sees pretty girls, and he says, how could this possibly be the site of the beginning of a war? There's no way the Japanese can get here. So they just thought if the war was going to come at all, the war was going to come the Philippines, Hong Kong. It would not come to Pearl Harbor. They horribly were mistaken, but it was just the prevalent thought on that date. I had never seen this photograph before, and I included it as a push pin. And what this is, these are Japanese pilots just a short time before they take off for Pearl Harbor. They are getting their final instructions from commanders about how to actually, commence the attack. And what I saw with this was an opportunity for, if you wanted to use this, an extension activity, a writing prompt to have students pretend that they are one of the pilots shown in this photograph. And the night before the attack, they know they're going into battle the next day. They know it's going to be a difficult attack. So what I would like them to do is write a letter to their parents or to their wives or somebody explaining their emotions as they prepare for this upcoming attack, and also what they plan to do, what their goals are, what they want to accomplish by attacking Pearl Harbor. So if they write this letter, that's an opportunity for them to use their creative ideas a little bit, and definitely an opportunity for you to get a sense of, do they understand what the impact of all this was? So is it related to, is it something we could have stopped at that point? The answer is no, but at the same token, it is something that students get an opportunity to view a little bit about the attack. I'll remind you at this point in time, definitely, if you have any questions or anything you want to add, please feel free to type that in the chat window, and Amy and I will be watching for those. If you have any questions, we'll try to answer them as we go along. However, we'll also have time at the end of the session so that we can answer questions then as well. So let's talk about why we were so complacent. Why did we let things go? Well, one of the reasons why was Pearl Harbor was very shallow. And the prevalent thought was that an attack launched from torpedo aircraft would not be successful. And the reason why was because the weight of the torpedo would be such that the nose of the torpedo would hit the bottom of the harbor before the torpedo could level out, and the torpedo would just detonate harmlessly in the bottom of the harbor. Another reason why was because steel plates on the battleships were extremely thick, several inches. And the prevalent thought was that if a bomb hit the deck of a battleship, it would just bounce off harmlessly. Well, there were two things that we didn't know. One thing was the Japanese had developed a new type of airborne torpedo, one that had special fins on it. And the fins allow the torpedo to draft more with the tail end hitting the water first rather than the nose end of it. That meant that it didn't go as far into the water before it leveled off and it went towards its target. The other thing we didn't know was that the Japanese had developed a brand new type of armor-piercing bomb. The bomb would hit the deck, it would actually cut through the deck of the ship, and it would explode several decks underneath. And so it would cause an extreme amount of damage in the interior of the ship. And this is what happened to the USS Oklahoma. The other concern, the other misread that we had, we believed if anything would happen at Pearl Harbor, it would be fifth column sabotage. It would be people who are Hawaii residents. They would be people who were spies for the Japanese, and they would sabotage boats or they would sabotage airplanes. So what did we do? Well, we put our ships close together so that they would be more easily observed, and we also put our planes in the middle of the airfields, wingtip to wingtip. Why? Because they would be easy to guard that way. There would be no possibility of any kind of sabotage, and there definitely was no sabotage. But however, because the planes were so close together, they were impossible to move apart. The Japanese saw targets, and it was very easy for them to hit the targets that they saw. The other reason why, as we mentioned before, why we were so complacent was just simply the distance from Japan. And as I mentioned when we first started this session this afternoon, most military experts believe that an attack would have to start closer to Japan, probably the Philippines, because of the geographic distance. They had no idea that the Japanese were planning and could actually carry out an attack that many miles away and do it without being noticed. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about the attack on Pearl Harbor, that it was not designed to be a sneak attack. It was designed to be a sudden attack, but not a sneak attack. What was supposed to happen was the Japanese ambassador was supposed to deliver a message to the U.S. Secretary of State saying that diplomatic relations were going to be broken off and a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. And then after that, the attack was going to begin. However, there was a delay in getting the statement that the Japanese ambassador was supposed to deliver transcribed into English from the code. And because of that, the attack had already started before the Japanese ambassador could get to the State Department. So it turned out to be a sneak attack, but it honestly wasn't designed to be that. One of the things that was a missed sign was the disappearance, so to speak, of the Japanese fleet. The graphic on the left side shows the different kinds of ships that attacked Pearl Harbor as well as the airplanes that were used in the attack. On the right side shows the route that the Japanese took from the mainland to Pearl Harbor. And as you can tell, they took a northern route and they did it purposely, even though it was more difficult. The weather was worse, and of course it's in the northern hemisphere in December, so it's nearly winter time. The reason why they took the route that they did was because they realized that the shipping routes were not very well patrolled at that time of year, and therefore they would not be found. However, one thing that did pick up the Japanese coming in was a radar unit at the Opano radar station. And at that time, radar was a brand new device. It was basically in its infancy. And 2 American soldiers were on duty practicing on the radar unit. They noticed a blip, and you can see the graphic that shows that blip on the right side of the screen. This again is another Stratologica screenshot, and it couldn't tell them where the planes or what country the planes belonged to, or how many planes there were, but the size of the blip indicated that there were probably in excess of 50 aircraft coming in, and they were coming in from the north. And so the servicemen called headquarters and they said, you know, we've got this blip on our radar screen. What is it? You know, should this be something we're concerned about? And the officer on duty said, no, not really. It's probably just planes coming in from the mainland. They're ours. Don't bother me anymore. Don't worry about it. Shut off the unit and go to breakfast, which they did. And so we knew the planes were on the way in, but we just didn't recognize that they were planes from the Japanese aircraft carriers, and they weren't American planes coming in. Again, a missed opportunity, something that we could have detected, we could have prepared, and we didn't do it. A story that a lot of people don't know about: the first shots fired at Pearl Harbor and the first casualties at Pearl Harbor were not fired by a Japanese plane, but by an American warship, the USS Ward. And about an hour before the attack, the Ward was on patrol outside of Pearl Harbor, and it was watching an American cargo ship enter the harbor through the submarine nets. And behind this cargo ship, the Ward spotted a conning tower from a submarine. And so they knew it wasn't an American sub. In what it actually was a Japanese miniature submarine, two-man sub that had been sent in advance to go into the harbor and sink ships. And so the Ward saw this, and it fired its ordnance at the conning tower and also dropped depth charges on top of where they thought the sub was. They radioed Pearl Harbor saying that, you know, sub spotted, sunk same. Well, U.S. Command didn't think it was a sub, so they let it go. They thought the commander of the Ward was mistaken. It turned out later he wasn't. In 2002, a University of Hawaii research team found the wreckage of the mini-sub in exactly the spot where the Ward said it was. And other than two shell holes in the conning tower that caused the sub to fill with water and sink, there was no damage. So the sub was sunk by the Ward. 3 years to the day after the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Ward is in the battle for the Philippines, and it's struck by Japanese kamikaze pilots. And it's damaged beyond repair. They can't tow it anywhere, so the decision is made to scuttle it, to have it sunk so that the Japanese can't capture the ship. So the commander of the USS O'Brien gives the order for the O'Brien to fire on the Ward after the sailors on board have all evacuated, and sink the ship. Ironically, the captain of the O'Brien was Captain William W. Outerbridge. Outerbridge had been on December 7th, 1941, the captain of the USS Ward, and he was the one who gave the order to fire at the conning tower outside of Pearl Harbor. So he was the one who ordered that the submarine be sunk, and then he's also the one that ordered that the Ward be sunk as well. So this is a relatively unknown thing in the Pearl Harbor lore, and certainly something that might interest your students about what happened and how there's a connection or the irony of all this. This map again is embedded in the presentation in Stratologica. It just shows the different waves that the Japanese used in the aerial attack on Pearl Harbor and the ships. There were two waves. The first wave went after the battleships. They also went after the airfields. One of the major errors that the Japanese made was they didn't order a third wave. The third wave would have gone in and probably gone after the fuel depot and other locations in Oahu, and that might have severely crippled us to the point where we couldn't have responded in the way that we did. The other thing that the Japanese didn't do, if you want an error on their part, was they realized that we had been severely crippled by the attack, but they probably should have backed up their aerial attack with a invasion of the Hawaiian mainland. If they had done that, then they would have easily taken Pearl Harbor and would have held American territory and would have had a superb base to launch an attack on San Francisco or Los Angeles or Seattle or anywhere on the west coast of the U.S. mainland. A famous telegram that probably some of you are familiar with, if you've ever been to the National Archives, you may have seen this. This is the famous air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. And this was sent to all U.S. military installations throughout the world after the attack began. And it's been a while since I've been to the National Archives, but this was on display at that time there, so I would imagine it still is. Okay, I mentioned a little bit about the USS Arizona before. One more time as we get closer to the end of our presentation this afternoon. Please feel free if you have any questions or anything you'd like to bring up as far as about what happened at Pearl Harbor, or about the attack itself, or the irony that we talked about with this. The USS Arizona, of course, was where nearly half of the casualties at Pearl Harbor, half the military deaths, were all located. And what happened to the Arizona was it had been hit by an armor-piercing bomb. The bomb had gone through several of the decks of the ship, and it detonated within the middle of the ship. And it detonated and just into the fuel chain and the ammunition chain inside the ship. So you not only had the bomb itself, but you had, in addition to that, you had all that fuel oil and all of that gunpowder detonating at the same time. And the film that's attached to this, or it's embedded in the slide, in the push pin, shows that detonation. And so around 1,100 of the 2,400 soldiers and sailors who died at Pearl Harbor died on board the Arizona. Most of them are still buried inside the ship. I have never been to Honolulu and never been to the USS Arizona Museum or Monument, but if you have a chance to go and you can vaguely see the outline of the ship underneath the memorial, it is an actual graveyard for most of those men who died that day. It's one thing that's interesting, again, that I've read and seen in documentaries are what are called the Arizona's tears, and there's still globs of lubricating oil, for example, that's inside the ship. So these globs of oil, because oil is lighter than water, will rise to the surface, and if you've ever seen oil on water, what happens is the oil will break down and it looks like a rainbow. And so if you see that on, at the Arizona site, that's what's called the Arizona's tears. Also, people who are survivors from the Arizona, they have a right to be buried along with their shipmates. The Arizona is still a commissioned U.S. ship. However, the National Park Service runs the memorial. And so if a soldier or sailor who was attached to the Arizona dies, what happens is their bodies are cremated, their ashes are put in an urn, and a diver from the National Park Service takes the urn below the water surface, and there are different places in the ship where they can drop the urn in, and so that sailor is reunited with his shipmates again. So students like to kind of get an idea about what what that's all about and all. And you may have students who actually have been to the Arizona Memorial. As I said, I have not, but definitely the choice between being in southern Indiana when the temperature's in the mid-30s right now and being in Honolulu where it's probably in the 80s, it's a no-brainer for me. So what happened the next day, and again, most students will know this already, Franklin Roosevelt goes before a joint session of Congress, and he asked for a declaration of war. So what I did on this slide, again, I'm still using the World War II in the Pacific, but what I did here was just link to the Capitol building, and you can see the Capitol building there. You can also see a red push pin with FDR's war message. So what I might do here is I might ask my students, again, this might be a good opportunity for a writing prompt. I could just simply say, have students listen to the war message. It's about 5 minutes in length. You know, and of course, I'll show you a little bit more about that in the next slide. And just have them pretend that they're the parents of somebody who's draft age, or somebody whose daughter is thinking of going into the military, or something, you know, what would be going through their mind knowing that the country is now at war? Would they be proud of the fact that their son or daughter would be going into the military to get revenge on Pearl Harbor? Or would they be afraid for their safety? Would they say, well, I don't want you to go into the military? You know, what would be their feeling? And that could be something that you know, I mean, might be a good writing prompt for that. Something that's not in the Stratologica presentation, but I thought it was interesting, so I included it in the PowerPoint. And this is a picture of the actual reading copy of FDR's speech, the first page of it. And as you can tell, he made quite a bit of editing on this. One thing that I thought was interesting, if you look at the very first line where he says, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in, and you know, he had the word world history. And he crossed that out, and he used probably the word that we more think about with this, the word infamy. Amy just asked an interesting question. Could that, with when I was talking about my writing prompt a minute ago, comparison between September 11th feelings, how people felt with, you know, the events that happened on that day, and what happened at Pearl Harbor. That's definitely a good idea. It might be rather difficult for the student to find someone who would be old enough to remember Pearl Harbor. You know, they would have to be close to about 90 years old now to have any recollection of it at all. And the thing that I think is kind of ironic with all this, and I mean, it kind of just flabbergasted me a little bit in the last couple of years. I have no students any longer who have any recollection of September 11th personally. Because even the oldest students that I teach, and most of them are like 17 or 18 years old, they would have been infants when 9/11 happened, assuming they were alive at all. And so what for you and I is kind of recent history, for them it's like the Roman Empire. It's ancient history. They have no clue other than what they've seen in documentaries, or just by chance what they've read about in books, or you know, what people have told them. And that, to me, it gives us a good insight into you know, what history is all about. You know, that it's a story, and even though they don't have any personal recollection of it, I certainly do, but it's, you know, but again, for me, everything I know about Pearl Harbor is what I've seen on documentaries, or what I've read, or what I've studied, because, you know, I wasn't alive in 1941. Amy mentioned that if there are students who are in New York, they probably have a stronger connection to it, just maybe because of the fact that maybe family members were directly involved. Maybe they were victims or they survived, or any number of things. But going back to FDR's speech, when he finished the speech, he left this copy at the podium, and a Senate clerk just picked it up and stuck it in a bunch of other papers that became part of the Senate records. And then in 1984, an archivist just looking through material came across this speech. So they took it from the Senate records, and instead it's in the National Archives. As I mentioned a while ago, it has been some time since I've been in the National Archives. Maybe somebody in the audience has been to the archives more recently. And if you have, this speech may be on display. I don't know for sure. But as you can tell, FDR did a substantial amount of editing just in this one page. I can imagine what the rest of the speech looks like. So let's wrap up by discussing a little bit about the aftermath, about what happened after December 7th. Well, the obvious, America entered World War II. We declared war against Japan the next day. Germany declared war on us a couple of days later. After early defeats, such as in the Philippines, American military might turns the tide in the Pacific. So what I might do, even though I don't have the map up again to show it to you, I would maybe indicate to students some of the more famous battles, such as Midway, for example, which kind of turned the tide. Also mention, some of the early battles in the European theater as well. How did that make things different or make things better? Excuse me. American used island hopping to push towards the Japanese mainland. So if you're interested in the strategy about how we fought in World War II, that's definitely a good, a good way to put it. To look at battles such as Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and then compare and contrast that with what happened in Europe. So at this point, pardon me, what happened is we are beginning to win some hard-fought battles. At the end of, or the middle of 1945, Germany surrenders, and the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the need to invade Japan, and the Japanese surrendered in September of 1945. So it came about full circle. However, you would probably want to impress on students that one war inevitably, in this case, led to another. Not so much a shooting war, but a war of aims, and we call that the Cold War. So we fought against the Russian, not so much the Soviet military force, but we fought against the Soviets' viewpoint and their aims in Europe, the Iron Curtain, or in Asia. Certainly, the Vietnam War is a good example of that, that we felt we had to stop the spread of communism in all of Asia. And so that would be true in Korea. That would have been true in Vietnam. And of course, it definitely is a concern now with North Korea. So the Second World War has long-term ramifications. It's not just what happened on December 7th and nothing else. So let's wind up by asking, first of all, if anybody in the audience has any questions that they'd like to share as far as what we talked about in the presentation. If by chance you feel that you'd like to contact me directly, there's my email address, hutchisonm@vcsc.k12.in.us. I promise if you email, I will reply. The session will be available at a later date. For the transcript will be available. You'll get an email thanking you for your participation this evening, and then also telling you how to link to the session. And as I mentioned, the Stratologica presentation is available for any of you. If you would like to download it, you're more than welcome to do that. The best way to do that would be to go to Stratologica, and I'm assuming you know how to log into Stratologica. And once you do, on the main screen, you'll see different menu choices. One is a menu button that has the word community. And if you click community, any presentation that has been shared or published by a Stratologica user will be available. And so you can just search for Pearl Harbor presentation and my presentation should come up. It's roughly about 11 different screens long. So I did that in order to have different things that I could show in this presentation, but you are more than welcome to use anything out of that that you feel is necessary, edit it in any way you'd like. Please feel free to use it with your students. You can also link to it on social media. The address is, you know, a URL shortener is there. So in conclusion, again, thank you so much for attending our session today. I hope it was an enjoyable 45 minutes for you. And certainly it's a very interesting subject, definitely with the 76th anniversary of Pearl Harbor just a couple of days away. And certainly I hope that anything that I shared with you today would hopefully be useful. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Michael, so much for a fascinating look at Pearl Harbor, and for people like me who have taught it before and who actually think that they know a little bit about World War II. You had lots of little nuggets of gold that were really fascinating and fun to listen to. So thanks for sharing.
Sure, and you know, like I said, if anybody has anything they want to email me about, they are more than welcome to do it. I don't know if the one thing I was a little concerned about, did I give them enough information about how to find the presentation and download it to their gallery, or do you want to add anything to that? Or
well, no, I think that's great. And of course, if anyone has a question about use of Stratologica, they can always contact there. Down at the bottom of the home page, there is a contact information and a phone number that you can call. But everything is found within the community. The community button is right up there next to your sign-in name. And once you're there, you just type in Pearl Harbor, and that list will come up, and you select the one that you want to look at, and then save to your gallery. And it'll always be the last thing that you save to your gallery is the first thing that opens in your gallery when you go into the gallery to look. And of course, you find your gallery listing when you open Maps and look up at the top, and you will find the word gallery right under the Atlas tab. So I think that people will know how to find what you have put there so that they can use it with all the little tidbits that you've talked them through. And we really appreciate it and hope that everyone will be thinking about the Pearl Harbor lesson that I'm sure that anyone that's teaching American history will be mentioning on Thursday. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Amy. It was a fun time, and I hope everybody got a lot of good information out of it.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.